Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome to today's webinar. My name is Aisha Al-Sarihi. I am a research fellow at the Middle East Institute. I'm very delighted to welcome you all to today's webinar, where we are going to discuss the implications of recently signed agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran with mediation of China. As we know, on the 10th of the last month, Saudi Arabia and Iran signed an agreement in Beijing, announced to restore the diplomatic ties, reopen the embassies in the two countries, and revive the security and economic agreements signed between the two countries more than 20 years ago. And as we saw today, the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia and Iran have met already in Beijing to discuss the reopening of the embassies and the restoration of the diplomatic ties. So in today's webinar, we are hoping to discuss different questions, including how remarkable this agreement is, and what is the rationale for the three players to come into this agreement? What does it mean for Iran, for Saudi Arabia, and China? What does this agreement has in store for regional security architecture? And what does it tell us about, the presence of the great powers in the region, especially for China and the US? So to answer those questions and more, I am very delighted to be joined today by distinguished speakers who have the first-hand expertise in this particular issue. And first of all, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Mohammed Sulami, who is the founder and president of the International Institute for Iranian Studies, rationale, which is an independent think tank based in Riyadh. He is also an associate professor of Iranian studies at Al-Qura University. Thank you for joining us, Mohammed. From London, we have Dr. Sanam Vakil, who is the director of the Middle East North Africa program at the Chatham House. She focuses on the regional security, Gulf geopolitics, and Iran's domestic and foreign policy. We also have with us from Singapore, our colleague from the Middle East Institute, Dr. Jean-Luc Salmon, who is a senior research fellow specializing in the Middle East strategic affairs with a particular focus on Israel-Hezbollah conflict and the evolution of the Gulf security system. So thank you very much for all the speakers for joining us today. But before we kick off the discussion, I just wanted to inform all of those joining us on Zoom. Please note that we have a space for the Q&A. We will spend the first 40 minutes for the opening remarks, and then we will open the floor for the questions. So please feel free to post your question on the chat box. So with that, I would like to start with you, Dr. Mohammed, with a question about the Saudi Arabia perspective. As we know, the negotiations to reach this agreement have started back in 2021. And the agreement have been reached almost 2 years later. So why is it now for Saudi Arabia? Why Saudi Arabia have decided to move on with the agreement? And what are the main priorities for Saudi Arabia? And if you could enlighten us about immediate priorities and long-term gains for Saudi Arabia signing this agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aisha, and thanks for our colleagues from London, Singapore, and from all our colleagues and friends who are following this webinar. And Ramadan Mubarak, although it's a bit late, but this is an important opportunity to congratulate you and those who celebrate Ramadan. As you know, almost 2 years ago, exactly, actually in April 2021, the first round of talks between Saudi and Iranian officials started in Baghdad. It was, I think, 9th of April 2021. We had 5 rounds of talks in Baghdad, and also we had other meetings in Oman. These meetings were on security level in particular, and we're trying to find ways to go forward. We have seen many and read many actually political and official statements from both sides about these meetings and what the issues were discussed during these meetings. They were positive environment, but at that time they said there was no real progress in that regard. And here we find the one who can play an important role, which is China. China is a good friend of both sides, Saudi and Iran. It is the trade number one for both sides as well. It is the country that was blamed to be a free rider in the Gulf by the American administration a few years back. Therefore, they tried to seize this opportunity to play a role in that. Why is it now for Saudi Arabia? For at least 4 reasons. One is taking consideration the 5 rounds of talks and the agreement, the meetings in Oman. It became very clear for Saudi that it seems to us that Iran is more serious in these discussions compared to other discussions in the past. This is one. Second, Saudi is adopting a zero problem foreign policy approach, which is very clear during the last at least 2 years. We know the Qatar issue, we know Turkey, and now Syria, and now Iran. So this is very clear indication for the new foreign policy in Saudi Arabia that is trying to minimize any differences, try to resolve all problems, try to extend hands to all regional players and beyond that. So this is I think one of the reasons why Saudi is taking this step right now. Third, in my opinion, reason is Saudi's strategy to seize opportunities under the multipolar world order. There is a huge discussion in the political environment, and you see it in media and everywhere, and that China is becoming more active in the geopolitics compared to its previous, tools, which is mostly economy, business, and soft power. Now, China is becoming more active, and many countries around the globe are not happy with the American, I would say, the American, policy or the way they engaging with at least the Middle East, and with the focusing on the withdrawal from the Middle East and from the Pacific and disengagement from this region. And of course, China is important in this regard because of their own initiative, Wooden Belt Road Initiative is focusing on this region. This is the main route for this initiative. To have a successful Chinese initiative, we need a stable Middle East, especially the Gulf region. Therefore, China is important in this regard. Third, and Saudi wants to play a role in that regard. Also for the future, that's try to have different partnerships, not only on the trade. Before we focus on that, China is the trade partner when it comes to security and politics. We are looking toward the West. Right now, it is not exactly the case, although it's still early to decide this, but we try to have, different variety of partnerships with different players that may, in a way or another, help Saudi Arabia and also, the Saudi interest comes first in this regard. Fourth, in my opinion, Saudi confidence in China as an international grand tour. This is very important. And I think this is why many people in the West, especially the United States, are not happy with the space given to China by Saudi Arabia and Iran, particularly Saudi Arabia. But this is the reality that we have been saying that China is very important player. It is the only country, and I've said that many times in the United States, that China is the only country that can play a role, a mediation role between Tehran and Riyadh, because it is the friend of both sides, and Iran is, there is a Chinese leverage over Iran in terms of trade, in terms of the Security Council and many international organizations. Iran doesn't want to lose China. Therefore, Saudi wants China to play a role in this regard, because the confidence in achieving a better deal with Iran. So these more important, in my opinion, reasons. For me, I don't know how much time I do have, but for short and long term, achievement for Saudi Arabia, I think one, it's good to have zero problem in the region. This is one of the immediate, goals of Saudi Arabia, taking consideration their Vision 2030, to have to attract more international investments in Saudi Arabia. So we need a very secure area. This is one. Second, Yemen is an important issue. I think we may have time to discuss that in more detail. Third, I think it's to send a message to the international community that Saudi wants to what the Crown Prince said, the new Europe is the Middle East. So they want to play a role in that regard. So to materialize this issue, that's, we want to have zero problems. We try to solve our problems among ourselves and with the other players like China, but also that means we still have a very good and strategic relation with the West. Doesn't mean we are shifting toward the East. West want to be in the middle to look after our interests, both East and West.
Thank you, Mohammed. So yeah, because of time, I have to stop you. Sorry for that. So now I want to move to you, Sanam, and I want to pose the same question, if it's okay, but from the Iran perspective. So why it is timely for Iran to come and sign the agreement now? And what are the anticipated gains for Iran from this agreement?
Thank you so much, Dr. Aisha. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you to the Middle East Institute for the invitation. And I'm really happy to be on this panel with Dr. Mohammed and Jean-Loup, so we can exchange our views. I think similar to Saudi Arabia, Iran had a number of domestic as well as regional motivations for making this deal. It had long been exchanging dialogue with Riyadh. And I think the timing of this deal is really important for Tehran, because it comes after Iran experienced many months of quite serious protests. And these protests, of course, posed a domestic challenge to the leadership in Tehran. But I would also argue that the protests have sort of changed the image of Iran among Western states and the international community, and really motivated and animated the Iranian diaspora, with many people seeing the protests as an opportunity to support broader regime change or revolution in Tehran. And the Islamic Republic, of course, is an institutionalized bureaucratic state that has been quite adept at managing threats. It has had a long history of managing domestic threat, regional threat, international threats, but it seeks to lower the temperature of the number of threats it's simultaneously managing. So I think that the primary motivation for Tehran to pursue this deal right now is to reduce the pressure in Iran as a result of the protests. And let me explain what that means. Obviously, Iran has been under serious maximum pressure sanctions since the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018. Despite the Biden administration's efforts at engaging with Iran, the JCPOA currently doesn't seem like a revivable framework. So there is no current opportunity for sanctions relief. And that means that ordinary Iranians will continue to be under economic pressure. At the same time, the pockets of the Iranian population are very much fired up and animated as a result of the protests. And the Islamic Republic has believed and constantly blamed external forces for supporting pockets of the protests inside Iran, as well as being behind diaspora-based news like Iran International. From Tehran's perspective, this deal accomplishes a few things. It reduces tensions directly with Saudi Arabia, and as part of the agreement, informally, there is some perhaps commitment that Iran International's presence in Europe and its activities in Europe will not be as inflammatory. Iran International has moved to Washington, D.C. conveniently. And this reduces the optics and symbolism and pressure for Iran within European capitals. There is also supposedly a commitment that domestic groups in Iran will receive less support, be it tangible or symbolic, from external forces as well. And this is important for the Islamic Republic. And thirdly, obviously, there is the huge symbolic gain of breaking maximum pressure and containment against Iran, and also showing that Iran has survived the protests and that Saudi Arabia would not have made a deal with a fragile, weak, precipice of revolutionary Islamic Republic. So it shows that the Islamic Republic remains intact, functional, and able to manage domestic pressure while also engaging in regional negotiations simultaneously. There is, of course, one added layer to this, that Iran, because of sanctions, is also seeking sanctions relief and is looking to build stronger regional economic ties as well as strengthen its ties with Beijing. And it has been deeply disappointed that China has not invested more in the Iranian economy. It does buy oil, albeit at a discounted and limited rate. And so it sees this agreement as building perhaps stronger economic ties with Beijing, and perhaps over time with Riyadh and other regional states as well. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sanem. Now, if I can move to you, Dr. Janlu, I know that you have a great expertise on the great powers. So a main question, like also when this agreement took place, is the evolving role of China in the Middle East. Is it going beyond economic relations? And then also, what does this agreement means for the U.S. presence in the region? If you can enlighten us on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha. And it's a pleasure to be also on this panel. Very briefly on that, because I'm sure we want to have as much time as possible for the conversation. The announcement of the deal was welcomed with shock and awe in Washington. But I think the first thing is that the agreement doesn't tell us really about the U.S. long-term presence. It tells us more about the Saudi perception of that U.S. presence. And Dr. Mohammed already covered some of these aspects. I think the announcement was a clear indication that Saudi Arabia and more broadly the Gulf states are more and more skeptical about U.S. resolve to intervene in their region. But apart from that, first on China's involvement in the region, I don't see at the moment this commitment as going beyond economic and diplomatic relations. The big question mark will be if China can really follow up with that deal. And the meeting which just took place today is a first test of that ability of Beijing to follow up, because the big question is what happens if or when Iran or Saudi Arabia just breaches some of the terms of the agreement. What happens if there's a nuclear armed Iran in a few years from now, or just if you have the Houthis firing rockets at Saudi territory, and talks of Iran keeping the supplies of weapons to the Houthis. So all of that, I think, will be a major test for China, because I'm not sure China wants to go beyond what it has already done in terms of diplomatic investment. And in comparison, what is quite interesting with all the talks about the deal is that the US is still the major actor in the region by far. Despite all the talks of the US disengagement, we're still talking about a country that has 30,000 troops on the ground permanently in the Gulf states, just in the Gulf states. It goes beyond that if we include the broader Middle East, but there's no other country that can do that. We can argue that China may want to have more influence in different ways, but even in terms of military cooperation, arms sales, this is pretty limited and will remain limited for the near future. So the agreement tells us a lot about the perceptions of the local partners, and that is troubling for US credibility. But in terms of the resources and the US policy, I think this will the real problem is in DC and how people in Washington want to prioritize the Middle East. There's I think, and I'll stop here, I think there's a contradiction at the moment, because the US clearly wants to de-emphasize its presence in the Middle East, but at the same time, it cannot accept the growing presence of China in the region. So I'm not sure, for instance, as Dr. Mohammed explains, the zero-sum or zero-problem policy of Saudi Arabia, I don't think this is a narrative that the US, in the current context in DC, can accept. This idea that, yes, traditional partners can have good relations with the US, with Russia, or in China. The US will still push its partners to make a choice. But this comes as a contradiction, especially when at the same time you're telling your partners, we're going to reduce our presence. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janlu. I'm going back to Dr. Mohammed, and another important question to this agreement is, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran for almost 7 years has created those proxies in the region. So, and the most important proxy is in Yemen, the war in Yemen. If you could tell us more on how will this deal help to resolve the issue of the war in Yemen?
Very important question. I think it comes at the core of this agreement, in my opinion. If we go back to the 5 rounds of talks in Baghdad, the main discussion was to actually build the trust between the two sides is the Yemen issue, that everybody knows that Iran is supporting Houthis with weapons, with intelligence, and of course they have different supports to the Houthis. And we have lots of evidence, official evidence of the drones and missiles that's coming from Yemen, of the Houthis, are Iran-made weapons. This is one issue. So this is, I think, it comes at one of the principles, I think, of this, and the pillars of this agreement. At the same time, Saudi started opening a channel, direct channel with the Houthis themselves. We know now that there was different Saudi, the small delegations traveled to Yemen and met with the Houthis, trying to encourage the Houthis to come to the table of negotiations along with other Yemeni political parties to have a Yemeni dialogue. We had one of which was in Riyadh last Ramadan, actually, exactly a year ago. So we had 10 days of Yemeni discussion. I was part of that, trying to facilitate the meeting. I'm managing one of the sessions for 10 days. So political session in particular. Yemeni, the Houthis were invited to join this Yemeni dialogue. And even after the beginning of the dialogue in Riyadh, in the GCC Council, still there was a Saudi statement that the Houthis still they couldn't come now, but anytime they can join the dialogue, the Yemeni dialogue. That was also a statement from the GCC officials in this regard. So now the main focus is to have a Yemeni dialogue, to go back to the national dialogue in Yemen, the GCC initiative, to the Kuwait dialogue, the Stockholm Agreement, all these different initiatives, just to put the women aside and try to come to the table of negotiations. Of course, Saudi for sure agrees that the Houthis are part of the political, construction in Yemen, but cannot be a state within a state. We cannot afford another Hezbollah on our border. This is the whole thing. But nobody can minimize or ignore their own rights to be part of the political, so either the government or the different parties. So this is very important. Now, I think going forward in this meeting, this is one of the main testing actually tools for if this agreement is strong or not, will that last for longer or not, if this is serious or is it tactical or strategic move from whether from Saudi or from Iran, but mostly if it's from Iran, because this is the way we have been asking the Iranians to just prove that they are serious in their discussions, in their statements are, we can see their own official statements, reality in the ground. So if we resolve the Yemeni issue, then I think we'll have a better deal and long-lasting deal. That means we'll have a better in terms of the political trade and everything with Iran. But within that few months to come, I think this is important to watch and see if the Houthis agrees, the Houthi group agrees to come to the table negotiations with the Yemenis themselves. We are not talking about Saudi Houthis agreement alone, but also we support the legitimate government. The international community supports the Yemeni legitimate government, and we ask the Houthis to come to the table of negotiations and try to reach an agreement with the government of the Yemen.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. Now I want to go back to you, Dr. Sanam. I also wonder if you have any further comments on how Iran views the issue of Yemen can be resolved. And also, I know, like you mentioned, that there are so far no signs for the sanction reliefs on Iran. But do you think that this agreement would have any implications for the GCOBA or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action? Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. I think that there is some hope in Iran that by lowering the regional temperature and showing signs of regional goodwill, that there would be a knock-on effect that could over time change the view in Europe, if not in the United States, towards Iran. I think that the acceleration of Iran's nuclear program, in conjunction with Iran's decision to send drones to support Russia during the war, and then add on top of that the impact of the protests, the visual of those protests and the government repression, it's very much hardened minds in European and Western capitals against the Islamic Republic. That I don't think that policymakers were completely deluded. Everyone knows that the Islamic Republic has been repressive to its own people and been a regional menace for decades now. But there was hope that the JCPOA could be revived. And I think that in still some capitals, there was some thinking that through these agreements, Iran would moderate or transform over time. Perhaps what we have finally arrived at is an awareness and an acknowledgement that we have to take the Islamic Republic for what it is, how it behaves. That transformation in the Islamic Republic isn't going to come from these international agreements. But it has posed a dilemma, I think, for European policymakers as well as for Iranian policymakers, because the Islamic Republic remains under serious sanctions. And if it wants to address its development conundrum, if it wants to address the lack of growth, the high levels of inflation, the declining currency, all of its years of economic mismanagement as well as corruption, it has to unlock its security dilemma with the West. So I think the thinking is, by showing moderation in the region and trying to find some direct regional off-ramps, that perhaps over time there could be new avenues for negotiations that could be developed towards Iran, and if not, and that's a clear option and a scenario that I think is under consideration, then Iran is also looking for its own economic plan Bs. It has managed to survive sanctions by building up what it calls its resistance economy, and it has embedded itself further in a predatory way in regional economies, using its willingness to export instability, but also using its network of influence around the region to extract economic gains. I think that the plan B is to embed itself further in the region. And so this is an interesting consequence of maximum pressure, but also of the de-escalation trends that we're seeing in the region, that Iran, that has always seen itself as strategically isolated and lonely, is finding value in its regional relationships and regional neighborhood. So can it extract and can it develop more productive economic relationships over a longer period of time? That remains to be seen, but that would be a positive for the economic development of Iran. And I think perhaps, it would be the first time that Iran might align its economic and regional foreign policy. The Islamic Republic is one of the unique states that doesn't align its foreign policy agenda with its economic agenda. And so should this be achieved, it would be a massive shift, but I'm not terribly optimistic, nor am I predicting that that's going to be the outcome. And in fact, I think the challenge will be actually in holding Iran accountable in this agreement. And, Yemen is going to be a very important test case to examine Iranian accountability, and also to let's say, for example, Iran does commit and is accountable in sort of halting the transfer of lethal aid to the Houthis. That could be a positive, but if Iran cannot convince the Houthis to accept concessions or remain in agreements or continue to negotiate in the direction of peace, is Iran going to be held accountable for that? And so it actually will tell us a lot about the nature of Iran's relationships with its networks around the region. There's always been an assumption that Iran has a command and control relationship around the region, but it certainly does not have that relationship with the Houthis. And so this is going to be an area, I think, where we're all going to be looking at. And ultimately, I personally think that Iran is never going to let's say, reduce its influence in Yemen, but it could transform the way it engages in Yemen, because it has found through its relationship with the Houthis a longer term ability to check and to impose pressure on Saudi Arabia. So from a rational perspective, why would it leave and why would it abandon a relationship that provides it a strategic gain over a longer period of time? So I think that the international community ultimately needs to create a process of accountability, and that does require UN, US, European presence and mediation. And I think that we also have to acknowledge that there are some strategic gains for Iran in its positioning around the region. It would be naive of us to assume that Iran is just suddenly going to withdraw or reduce its support. It might transform the way it engages in Yemen or in Iraq or in Syria. But strategically, it is irrational to think that Iran would leave areas that it has developed some form of leverage that has over time paid off for the Islamic Republic.
Thank you, Dr. Sanam. So the situation seems still a bit cautionary, and it's not still very complicated. Now I want to move to Dr. Janloub with another important question also when it comes to the agreement. It's about the regional alignment. Now, this agreement has been brokered by China between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But previously, during the Trump administration, the Abraham Accord was, brokered by the U.S. And it involves so far the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. So it's a question about, the regional realignment. I think my question is, do you think that those two agreements go in line with one another, or there's a divergence going to happen?
Thank you, Aisha. And I think it's a major question, and the answer would probably be different if we ask in Israel or in the Gulf. Definitely in Israel, the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran was welcomed as a setback, because the Netanyahu government and Netanyahu himself made very publicly the goal of normalization with Saudi Arabia. He made it a personal goal. And just one day before the Saudi-Iran deal, there were talks of Saudi Arabia discussing with the US administration its own conditions for normalization with Israel. But that being said, I don't think from the Gulf perspective, this is a zero-sum game. I don't think that Saudi Arabia or even the UAE, which already engaged with Iran starting in 2019, see this rapprochement or this warming up of ties with Iran as a movement away from Israel. And I think this relates again to the idea of the zero problem policy. I think at the moment, Gulf countries are in this moment of cooperation or re-engagement with all the different actors. It remains to be seen if that can last, but I don't think what we see right now with this Saudi-Iran deal means that we won't see anything else with Israel. Now, having said that, I think the real problem with the normalization momentum between Israel and Gulf states has less to do with the deal with Iran than with the current situation with the Netanyahu government and the situation in the West Bank. I mean, clearly, this is more an issue for the UAE than for Saudi Arabia, obviously, but clearly at the moment, this is more the factor behind Gulf policy towards Israel rather than relations with Iran. But eventually, the question of these two movements, relations with Israel or relations with Iran, will be again put to the test when you have a crisis like those that were discussed earlier about the nuclear issue with Iran, which is not solved, or the situation in Yemen. And in the case of Israel, probably possibly escalation in Lebanon with Hezbollah, which is not completely far-fetched at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the speakers for those opening remarks. I think we covered a lot of ground, and now I want to open the floor for questions. So anyone who have questions, please feel free to post them on the chat box. So far, I have one question for Dr. Sanam. It's from our colleague Asif Shuja. He is asking, how will the Iran-Saudi deal impact the hijab protest in Iran? And will Iran become less committed to the deal as soon as it gains complete control over these protests?
Thank you for the question. So I think it's April 6th, and I think it's important to acknowledge that the protests more or less have come to an end. It has, I think, regained control over the protests. There have been intermittent protests in connection to this anniversary of individuals' deaths. We have seen intermittent protests also in Sistan and Baluchistan, where the Baluchi community has continued to protest in a more determined way. But in most of the urban centers, the protests have come to an end. And I think that it's quite clear also from the media coverage. I have not seen a single story about the protests for quite some time now. So as I sort of suggested in my opening remarks, for the Islamic Republic, it's important to show that it has, in fact, asserted control over the protesters. There is also debate, I think, taking place inside Iran in how to manage the level of grievances and dissent that have emerged from across Iranian society. These protests were definitely female-led, but the only grievances were not female grievances. You saw economic grievances, deeply political oriented grievances as well. And so there's certainly certain levels of engagement across the political establishment underway. And I think that this agreement with Saudi Arabia is about reducing external pressure on Iran, perhaps through the Saudi support for diaspora-based media, perhaps for support for groups inside the country. This showcases a longer term objective that the Islamic Republic intends to continue to clamp down on protests and continues to be assertive in managing its domestic population and preventing, I think, perhaps another outbreak of this magnitude. Now, protests do take place in Iran more commonly, I would say, than in all other states across the Middle East. We have seen serious political protests over the past 2 decades, from 2009 with the Green Movement protests, in 2017 and 2019, which were economically driven protests. But these protests really were quite different. I think this was a sort of the biggest wake-up call that the political establishment has felt and seen since it has been in power. What it remains to be seen is if the leadership in Iran is going to make shifts and make concessions to the protesters in a formal way. There are perhaps some informal concessions being made where there is, maybe despite what is being reported, I hear quite anecdotally that women are already flouting the veiling laws, and there is no direct sort of police oversight in patrolling how women are currently dressing. Doesn't mean that the morality police is completely banned, or it doesn't mean that there is a legal change in how women's rights and women's dress is acknowledged in the public domain, but there are some sort of de facto shifts that have immediately been seen in Iran. We have to continue to watch and see if these shifts are going to be permanent or if this is a transition phase. And so, again, I think this is ultimately about reducing pressure for the establishment to think about how they can manage the multitude of threats that they're facing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanam. There is another question. I am going to pose it to all of you. It is from Ambassador Gorgi Bostin. He is asking, is the deal going to impact the return of Syria into the Arab fold? Dr. Mohammed? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think this is another issue, but it's still a bit different from, and it's not directly connected to the Saudi-Iranian agreement. There has been lots of activities in the region about re-engaging the Syrian regime. And I think with that start maybe last year, we have seen many visits from Minister of Foreign Affairs and from Arab countries or officials to Damascus. And also we know that some Arab Gulf states reopened their diplomatic missions in Damascus. United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and others reopened their own diplomatic missions. So also Saudi started reopening their own consulates and our consul services in Damascus. That means they came to a conclusion that there is no any signs that Bashar al-Assad will go. So he will be there. And there are lots of Syrian refugees around the globe, actually, not only in the neighboring countries, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Jordan, Lebanon, and some European countries, but also everywhere. So we need to help the Syrians to have a better life, to go back home, and try to put some pressure on the Syrian regime. And we are not talking about total change, but at least a gradual change, maybe in the behavior, in the way, at least some guarantees for the Syrians who are brought to go back. Nobody will, no security trace to those people or to be brought to jail. So this is very important. And therefore, I think the Arab Summit in Riyadh next month, I think 19th of May, will be the turning point in terms of relation with Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. So is that part of the Saudi-Iranian agreement? Might be, but not reality. It's not directly connected, but because of the Iranian policy in the region, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. So people will see it that way. But in reality, I think it's an Arab initiative and effort from some Arab countries, especially Egypt and other countries, to convince Arab countries to re-engage with Bashar al-Assad.
Okay, thank you very much. Janlum, did you want to comment?
Very quickly, maybe. And as Mohammed just said, I think the normalization of Assad started before the Saudi-Iran deal. And seen from Damascus, I'm sure that the Assad regime sees the deal as an additional element that can ease the pressure on it and possibly allows it to restore its diplomatic relations with all the actors in the region. But having said that, I think actually Syria will be an interesting test because this normalization between Gulf states and Assad was also initially started with the assumption that getting closer to Assad would be a way to put Assad at the distance from Iran and to decrease Iranian influence inside inside Syria. Because I don't see, honestly, objectively, common objectives for Saudi Arabia and Iran inside Syria. The Iranian military presence is quite strong right now in Syria. If we discuss in details the Syrian question, we get into the issue of Lebanon, which is also a very delicate issue for both Saudi Arabia and Iran. So at the end of the day, I think that on the very short term, people may assume that this will enable greater or ease the relations with the Assad regime, but it will also put the two countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, in front of major contradiction or major disagreements on what they want in Syria.
Okay, thank you very much. Sanam?
Can I just say one thing here on the Iranian perspective of this? I think oftentimes there is an assumption that Iran might be unhappy by the Arab sort of reconciliation towards Assad, but the view in Iran is actually one that is quite supportive of reconciliation. From Tehran's perspective, this vindicates Iran's defense of the Assad regime, and it invites other countries to engage, particularly economically, in Syria, that reduces the pressure for Tehran. And so I think it's important to think about what that means. Iran is confident enough in the relationship and is adapted enough in managing its network of relationships around the region that we shouldn't see these relationships in zero-sum terminology. And when Iran has less economic pressure coming from this network that it has developed through the years, that poses opportunities also for Iran. Ultimately, what Iran seeks with the groups that it has supported over a 4-decade period is the interdependence, but also independence of those groups. These are actors that Iran can sometimes extract concessions from, sometimes will not be able to call upon to represent or support Iran's objectives, political, economic, or regional. But for these actors to become legitimate political players is a long-time goal of the Islamic Republic. Hezbollah's role in the Lebanese government is one example of that. Seeing proxy groups in Iraq also step into the political domain is an important opportunity for Iran and that network, but also in the case of the Houthis, the same concept applies here. Iran would like to see these groups as legitimate political actors in these countries. So the idea that the Gulf states could peel off these relationships really has to be looked at through a generational kind of decade, if not 2-decade kind of investment, because these are the kind of investments and the relationships that Iran has built with these actors over the course of multiple decades. And I would also add one more caveat. The Islamic Republic and Assad relationship is really historical. It's, dates back to Assad Sr. And I think that that's important to understand because Iran plays on these sort of historical ties, again, not always to get what it wants, but to show the durability through the ups and downs, through the good years and the bad years, and that it is a reliable actor. And that is a model that has proved to be helpful for Iran in the region.
Thank you very much, Sanam, and to all of you. I think it sounds like there is a lot of test for the agreement to become successful. There is the issue in Yemen, in Syria, and also in Lebanon. Unfortunately, we don't have much of time, so I am going to conclude with one final question, and I'm going to pose it to all of you. It's actually perhaps it is the way forward for the agreement. How do you think that this agreement can be a success this time moving forward? And can I start with Dr. Mohammed, maybe? And you have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. It is very important agreement, but we should be optimistic, but we have to be very careful in our optimism. This is one thing. Second, there are working groups from both Saudi and Iranian sides. They will have to put all the things on the table, and they have to deal with every single issue between the two countries. So then do we agree on everything? Should we reach an agreement, or should we postpone some of the issues in order to solve others? So this is very important and will unfold during the coming, I think, months, not weeks, but months. Third, this agreement doesn't resolve all issues between the two sides. We have to acknowledge that. Third, there are lots of difficulties in implementing this agreement on the ground to see the result, the positive result, a normal relation between the two sides, to have a full diplomatic, not only diplomatic, but normal relations. That is because even before 2016, we had lots of difficulties with Iran, but we had diplomatic ties with Iran at that time. So that doesn't mean much. So we have diplomatic relations, but doesn't mean that we have no problems. We will continue to have several, I think, problems between the two sides because the nationality, the nationality of the two sides, the political sides, the models of the governance of two sides. But if there is a will from both sides, we will work maybe slowly to resolve most of the problems. And of course, if there is no huge changes in the region, if there is no wars, if there is no those players who want to bring an end early into this agreement to see the differences, because they want to see differences on problems between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because it is an investment for them. So I think with the time, we will be more sure if this continuous and sustainable agreement or not.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. Dr. Sanam, you want to come in?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think this agreement is a real reflection of changing dynamics in the Middle East. I think that Middle Eastern states, far beyond just Saudi Arabia and Iran, although this is a really consequential shift, have been moving towards this pattern of de-escalation now for a few years. And so this is a positive shift, but we shouldn't see, I think we should be careful and not see all of this de-escalation in zero-sum terms, as Jean-Loup and Dr. Mohammed have also said. This is a time of regional promiscuity. Everyone is normalizing. There is a lot of opportunity out here. Just because Saudi Arabia and Iran are reconciling doesn't mean Saudi Arabia and Israel won't reconcile. There's plenty of opportunity to build on this momentum of de-escalation and build towards integration. But I think what's missing here is actually a more multilateral support from the international community. These are nascent shifts that require a huge amount of diplomatic investment to build trust that has been frayed on all sides of the region. Within the Gulf, that is taking place since Al-Ula, but we're still not there, and it's going to take a long time to really build back trust in those dynamics. Israel and the UAE, Israel and Bahrain, these normalizations are fully underway and in full swing, but again, there is much people-to-people work that needs to be done in order for societies to truly understand and make progress. There needs to be an investment in conflict management, addressing the ongoing crisis in Palestine. So there's a lot of work here, and so we should be watching and be supportive, but the international community, I think, needs to step in and scaffold and support some of these arrangements so that processes and can be built, greater interaction can lead to maybe more institutionalization of regional security ultimately in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanam. Dr. Jean-Loup, please.
Yes, well, I mean, I fully agree with Sanam and Mohammed in the sense that we should start by saying that the success of this deal will be defined by our expectations, and the expectations should be realistic. I think that's the lesson of the discussion so far. At the end of the day, the big concrete achievement is that we're back to 2016 when Saudi Arabia and Iran had, let's say, normal diplomatic relations. That's the first concrete achievement of the deal. And I think it's something that shouldn't be dismissed, shouldn't be underestimated, to have diplomatic relations, open diplomatic relations between the two countries. Having said that, the major objective, I think the very concrete objective should be to remove Iran from the equation in Yemen, meaning that I think it's possible to see decreasing the role of Iran in supporting the Houthis, but I don't think this will solve the war in Yemen. I don't think, and I think this was said before, that the war in Yemen started before Iran increased its support to the Houthis. So I don't think a Saudi-Iran discussion on Yemen will suddenly solve all the issues in Yemen. Beyond that, let's say that this deal should be seen again as a stepping stone, or a part of a regional momentum where all the different players, Gulf states, Turkey, Israel, Iran, are in one way or another more open to cooperation, which is quite unprecedented in a sense in the region. It's not all the time that you see discussions about deals in the Middle East. So we should praise that. But beyond that, I don't think this is the deal that would solve, obviously, all the issues between the two countries, and more broadly, let's say the regional competition between Iran and Gulf states.
Well, thank you very much. It is 6:01 already. So thank you very much for the speakers for enlightening us about this, the implications of the deal in the region, as well as the involvement of the great powers in the region. And it sounds that the deal is both promising, but also the challenges remains ahead to see if the deal is going to live to its promise. With that, I would like to thank everyone, and a special thanks again to the speakers for your time and for the insights. And I also would like to thank the event organizer, Sharon, for putting this event together. With that, I'll leave you and have a nice evening, morning, or afternoon. Goodbye.